Okay, good morning everyone. I have to warm up here, don't worry. Okay. Are we ready? So welcome to week 5. Just before we start, winter's arrived in case you haven't noticed. I thought no one would come today. Thank you, brave. So just before we start, we have, just to let everyone know, we have 2 more weeks of this series. So next week and the week after, we'll still continue on different emotions and channeling. Then on the 20th of June, we're not going to have a class. Just wanted to let everyone know, give you a heads up, planning ahead. And then on the 27th of June, for 2 weeks, we'll just have a mini-series. I'll tell you the topic closer to the time. So the 20th of June, I'll be away, so we won't have a session. But then 27th and the week after, we'll have just 2 weeks, a small series before the school holidays. And then start again afterwards. Okay, so first of all, just to review from last week, we dealt with that third part of that passage, the pursuit of honor, which can be very dangerous and very destructive, but we talked about the healthy channeling of it, which is the idea of dignity and inner strength. First we discussed the bow and arrow concept from Lag BaOmer, which is digging deep into our own soul. And we talked about the concept of pursuit of honor. So normally pursuit of honor is a destructive thing because it's a sign of insecurity, where people define themselves by the outside, by the externalities, by things that are happening superficially. But the channeling, the healthy, the positive expression of that is the concept of inner dignity, protecting dignity, because with the acknowledgement and the understanding that we all have intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, we all have the divine imprint known as the Tselem Elokim, we're created in the image of God. And that idea of the Har Sinai that we spoke about, the mountain of Sinai, where the Torah was looking for humility, but humility which came from strength. That's why it's a mountain, not a valley, right? And we related that concept to preserving the dignity and respect of others, because the concept basically behind it is that if pursuit of glory is a superficial thing, then we don't make room for others, because that's an insecurity. It's an egocentric thing, and it normally comes from protecting ourselves, and therefore we don't make room for others. However, when the preserving the strength and being strong and coming from strength and having the inner dignity and preserving the intrinsic value and the Tselem Elokim, the divine imprint, if it comes from the inner soul, then automatically what happens is we make room for others because we preserve it in ourselves and we preserve it in others as well. Okay. Now today we're going to talk about another emotion, a very problematic one that we all have on different levels, and that's the concept of fear. Being fearful of something, being scared of something, right? Now I often say this, but it's just really important to always mention this, because especially when we talk about things like fear and anxiety and obsession and things like that, it operates on different levels. So one level it could operate on within human beings is a clinical level, where it's actually at a very deep, intense level. It's a pathology, it's a sickness, it's a disease. And that's an important discussion, but it's not this discussion, right? Because that discussion is about talking about feelings of fear or anxiety that we're not in control of. And that needs different intervention and very important thing to highlight, but it's not what we're talking about here. The reason I mention that is because we should never confuse emotions and feelings that we are in control of with feelings of fear or anxiety or other emotions that we're not in control of. They're very different. The one is very deep and foreign, and it's a foreign idea that comes into us and takes hold of people like any physical sickness, and that's a whole different discussion. Obviously they have some overlap and sometimes one triggers the other, but they're different. What we're talking about here is normative emotional reaction to things, and in this context the idea of fear that many of us have, and it's just the way of operation, the way that we operate, and that's the type of fear that we're going to be discussing. Now, fear comes in many, many different shapes or forms. However, what is true about all fears, things that we're afraid of, is that it's paralyzing and it makes us stuck. Hence the picture there, right? It makes us stuck, and importantly, it stands in the way of a progress, it stands in the way of growth. It often prevents happiness, an inner feeling of happiness, where happiness or the intrinsic feeling of happiness is so important for personal growth. It's important for expansion, it's important for confidence to grow and to explore new ideas. And fear, when we are worried about things and we are fearful and frightened about things, often that paralyzes us in a figurative sense, in a spiritual sense, at least emotional sense, where it stops us from making progress, it stops us from taking risks, it stops us from exploring things, and so on and so forth. So that's with all fears. But what we're gonna also talk about is that fear is often the basis then for other negative feelings, right? Which we'll see. Now, confronting fear is really important. As I said, because it's a really important thing to deal with, because sometimes it's the basis of us getting stuck, and it's the worst thing for the human being, and so on and so forth. There is I once mentioned this a long time ago, but there's a book by a woman called Susan Jeffers. A book is called "Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway," right? And there she talks about that fear is often a very paralyzing emotion that needs intervention, but most of the time, she says, what fear is, according to her, is an educational problem. What I mean by that is a concept that's written in Jewish sources that we've talked about many times, but often it's a matter of perspective, because we have the idea of moach shalit al halev. The brain controls the heart, the brain guides the heart. And often fear that we feel emotionally, fear that we feel in our heart, comes from the way we're looking at the world or looking at ourselves, right? So that's the important idea to explore, to understand our perspectives, understand our mindsets of what is it that's triggering that feeling of fear. And sometimes when we change the way we think, we change the way we feel, which is true with all emotions, but particularly with this concept of fear. So what we're going to talk about is the destructiveness of fear and the strategies to deal with fear. And then, of course, talk about the concept of channeling. What's the positive expression in the idea of fear? Now, sometimes at a very, very basic level, fear is just from the unknown. Human beings are frightened of things that they aren't familiar with, right? I mention this because Rabbi Moss, who writes a very beautiful article every week, he once wrote a very cute article about someone who asked him a question of why religious Jews are scared of dogs. So which is true, by the way. Dogs, right? So he answered by saying that he knows how the dog feels, because he says he gets a similar reaction about a lot of people who are scared of rabbis. And he says it's for the same reason. It's the unknown. So culturally, religious Jews in many, many communities don't have pets for whatever reason, but so maybe a lot of them have large families, that's enough to take care of already, but they don't have pets or dogs particularly. And therefore kids grow up without dogs and are scared of dogs. They see a dog, they get scared, right? Some of my kids are petrified of dogs. With my youngest child, actually, I'm very grateful for an Israeli babysitter that we had when she was like 2 or 3. And she used to take her to the park and let her play with dogs, and she developed a more confidence with dogs. Anyway. And he said that's the same thing with rabbis. A lot of people don't know who rabbis are, so when they see a rabbi, they get scared, right? So just a very, very basic fear is the fear of the unknown. However, on a more serious note, what I want to talk about is 2 kinds of fear. Right? There's 2 kinds of fear. There's fear about things that we cannot control, that might happen, which are really out of our control, and yet we're very scared of them. And then there's fear about things which actually we are in control, and we have to explain where that fear comes from and why that fear is there, right? So just let's go through this a little bit, right? So there are things that happen in life which we can't control, because it's not to do with our emotional state or emotional reaction. It's got to do with things that happen in life. Aging, becoming disabled, being alone, children leaving home, loss of financial security, change, accident, losing a loved one, all these things are not things that are in our control. They are things that happen either as part of the cycle of life or happen, unfortunately, when God decides they need to happen for reasons that we don't understand. But what often happens is, and particularly when people feel these things happening a lot around them at a particular time, often people become instilled with fear of these things happening to them or happening to their loved ones or happening to people around them, right? Then we have fear of things which are in control. So fear of things that we need to do. For example, we need to make decisions. Some people are very scared to make a decision, right? You have indecisive people. Very intelligent people, very stable people, very happy people, but when it comes to making a decision, they just can't make a decision, right? Making friends. Some people are very feared to introduce themselves to a new social circle. Beginning a relationship, ending a relationship, right? Driving, I always have to put it in there, of course. Being interviewed, right? People go to a job interview, that could be really, really scary. And there's sometimes a lot of anxiety, real fear. Public speaking, making a mistake, intimacy sometimes. All these things are things that, she points out in a book, things that people are scared of, but they're not things that are going to happen. They're things that we need to do, things that we need to make a decision to do or not to do. And we have some level, particularly when it's a value-based thing, we have some level of choice in the matter, which God has given us, and yet we're scared to jump into them. So they're two very different types of fears. The feeling could be the same, the paralysis is often the same, the effects are the same, but they come from very, very different sources, right? Now, the strategy for each one is very different. So let's talk about the strategy for the first one. So in a Jewish context, the strategy for the first type of fear, right, comes from the whole concept of surrender, of bitachon and emunah, what we call, right? Positive thinking. So the fundamental to Jewish thought is the concept of emunah, faith. Faith meaning that everything that happens is for a reason. Everything that happens comes from God ultimately. Even when things happen in the past that we don't understand, that are painful, they're still painful, but yet we have faith that they meant to happen or they happen for a reason that is beyond us. We don't understand the reason, nor should we even try to understand the reason. That's an important thing, by the way. We mentioned this many times. Sometimes when things happen that are negative, in the past I'm talking about, we don't have to find answers. Right? People often look for answers and they never find the answers because answers are sometimes not meant to be there. By definition, the whole concept of emunah, the whole concept of faith in God is faith in a being that is beyond and transcends our understanding. Right? That's a very important concept. This goes for big global things like the Holocaust and other tragedies that happened to the Jewish people. Right? People say, how could it happen? Why? Right? These questions are good, and they don't need answers, nor should they have answers. Right? Because certain things, the response is not answers, certain things, the response is just faith, acceptance. And that's an acknowledgement of the fact that it's almost a submission, a surrender to a higher being, that we don't know. It's painful, he knows it's painful, he doesn't expect it not to be painful, and yet he decided it should happen, and therefore we accept it, right? It's very interesting, I think I've mentioned this before, that one of the things we do after losing a loved one is we say Kaddish, right? I don't know if you know this, but everyone always understands the importance of saying Kaddish after a person that's passed away and so on. But you know that Kaddish has nothing to do with death, you know that? If you look in the Kaddish, it's got nothing to do with the person passing away, it doesn't mention the soul, it's got nothing to do with any of that. Kaddish has all to do with believing in God, that's all it is. Right? It's an acknowledgement of God. Yitkadal v'yitkadash merabah means may the God's name be glorified and exalted. It's belief in the coming of redemption. It's belief in the transcendence of God, and so on and so forth. Because that's the amazing Jewish strength, that in the face of something bad that happens, we strengthen ourselves and we strengthen the soul of the person that is no longer here by saying Kaddish, by expressing our connection to God, by being connected to something that transcends us. So that's things that happen in the past. Things that happen in the future, we have an extension of the concept of faith in Jewish writing. An extension of the concept of emunah called bitachon. Bitachon means positive thinking and trusting that things will work out. Right? In other words, not letting go of worry about things that aren't in our control, right? You know, the natural disposition of people often is not to do that. It's very interesting. I was looking into this concept. Came across an article of someone writing about an article that he had read from Dr. Tversky, who writes about fear and anxiety and so on. And he says, that sometimes people always have, and it's almost like a disposition that we have sometimes, to have negative expectations. We always worry, we always expect the worst kind of thing, right? And he said just a very silly story about himself. He says that he's a doctor, or I don't know what he was. He was a doctor, lawyer, professional, has clients. And his secretary knew that when he's in with a client, he shouldn't be disturbed unless it's an emergency, right? So one day he's sitting in the office with a client, and the secretary rings through and says, "It's your daughter-in-law." So he says, "I froze, expecting something terrible," right? Daughter-in-law gets on the phone and says, "Mazel tov, you had another grandchild." And so it's a crazy thing. I mean, he obviously knew that people generally know for a couple of months ahead that they expect their grandchild, right? Okay, maybe it was a week or two early, I don't know, but right? But he said still like that initial reaction, right? Because people do that, human beings do that. We kind of, some of us more than others, we have a disposition to get nervous about things, right? I think today, it's got to do a bit more with technology, because I think today we feel more in control of things. So when things go out of control, we get all frightened. I was just saying to someone yesterday, it's an amazing thing. I remember when I went to yeshiva when I was a student. I left Johannesburg and went to yeshiva. We wrote letters, those things, old-fashioned things called letters. Remember those aerograms? And I spoke to my parents not very often. Once in a while, I'd make a reverse charges call from a payphone. And they were fine, I was calm, they were calm, and they trusted everything was fine, everything was good, right? Today, we're in constant contact with everyone, all the time, and I know this for myself, because I have kids overseas, and I'm sure many of you do too, and if you can't get hold of them on WhatsApp for like 45 minutes, suddenly you can't understand what happened, is everything alright, right? So that's a worry, but it's worrying about things we totally are not in our control. And one of the greatest foundations of faith in terms of the future. So faith in terms of the past is, even when sometimes things do happen that aren't good, we accept it. But in terms of the future, we are trained and taught and encouraged to have what we call bitachon. Bitachon means to trust. We're in God's hands, He knows what He's doing, things will work out, and things will be okay. And we are further taught that positive thinking itself is what brings blessing, right? Today in modern psychology they talk about it as well, but in Jewish writings that's certainly true. There's a verse that says, he who fully trusts and relies on God, kindness will surround him. Now that doesn't mean that God doesn't do things sometimes that we don't understand, but our strategy really is to let go of future worry. Now we've talked about this before in the context of mindfulness, right? That we know that one of the things I talk about in mindfulness is being in the moment. In other words, letting go of the past, letting go of the future. Now what that means is, and that's a hard thing to do, but letting go of the future doesn't mean not considering the future. We'll talk about this later. Considering the future is very important. In other words, making decisions now, being responsible human beings to make the decision, we have to consider the consequences of tomorrow. That's fine. When things happen, things that we could control, when someone in the family is not well, or when something's happening and we can get help, professional help or medical help or some sort of advice, we need to go to the best places and we need to make decisions and do the best we can. That's the moral responsibility that we have, to live responsible lives and to make decisions that in our mind at least will bring the best result. But after that, we have to let go. It's interesting that human beings often do the exact opposite. We sometimes make decisions, impulsive decisions or rash decisions in the moment without considering consequences, where we should have considered consequences. And yet we worry about things that are out of our control, that we can't worry about, right? So, the perspective, if we talk about fear being guided by the way we think, the perspective of changing our mind in terms of dealing with the first category of fear is that concept of faith, that concept of understanding that we're not in control. Understanding that principle we always talk about is that everything in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven, which means everything is controlled by God except for the way we respond to it, right? That concept of surrender. Now, surrendering is a very difficult thing to do. Bitachon, by the way, is something that people work on for an entire life. It's not something you can master in a minute. get better at it, hopefully, as we go along and we start to worry less. But it's something that is difficult because human beings generally don't like to surrender. Particularly nowadays, when we think we have so much control, generally people don't like to surrender. They don't like to surrender to other people. They don't like to give in to other people around them. And therefore, by extension, we don't like to give up ourselves to a higher being either. However, fundamental to responsible living and fundamental to happy living, really, and fundamental to spiritual living is certainly the concept that readiness to submit, to surrender to something higher than ourselves, and to believe that there is something higher than ourselves. In other words, to believe that our thinking, our logic, our rationale is not the be-all and end-all. It's very limited. In fact, our own mind is very fragile. And there's something and someone and a being which is much higher than us that transcends the limitation of who we are, and surrendering to that means letting go of what we can't control, letting Him control the world, and let us respond responsibly the way we're supposed to respond. Worry about the things that we can control, but let go of the things that are out of our control. So that's obviously in a nutshell the strategy in terms of that fear. However, that's only one type of fear that we have, right? But then there's other kinds of fear. The fear of things that we could control, like we said before, making decisions, being interviewed, public speaking, I don't know, whatever the decision is, right? Often we have a lot of fear in doing things that we're not completely comfortable with. Now, where does that come from? And how do we deal with it, right? So obviously where that comes from, and by the way, this is a very deep-rooted thing, and on many different levels, even great people suffer from this, as we'll soon see, right? So, so these are the things that drive that fear, right? We have a fear of being rejected. We have a fear of success sometimes. The fear of success comes from the fear of failure. In other words, people don't like to move out of their comfort zone. Right? I mentioned this many times. The Jews, when they were in Egypt, didn't want to leave Egypt. They were oppressed. They were persecuted. They were enslaved. But that is what they knew. And to move into something that they didn't know was hard for them. They rejected it. They resisted it. Not only did they resist it, but when they eventually did leave, and things started to get shaky, and they were faced with a challenge, they started to complain. Why did you take us out? The cucumbers and the onions in Mitzrayim were much better, right? So they said, that's what the Pasuk says, that's what it says, right? In other words, at the Red Sea, when they saw they were trapped by the Egyptians, they'd seen the plagues, they'd seen everything. Suddenly they turned to Moses and says, you schlepped us out, well, there's not enough graves in Mitzrayim, you needed to take us out to bury us in the desert. All these type of things. Why? Because people are very fragile. People are very insecure. Particularly because they're fragile, right? People don't like to fail. Why do people not like to fail? Obviously, subtly, that comes from our own ego, because we're insecure. We worry about the perception of other people, as we've talked about many times. We worry about how people will perceive us, how people will define us. And how people will define us obviously has to do with how we define ourselves. Because obviously we define ourselves by the way people perceive us, or the way we perceive ourselves in terms of our accomplishments and our successes. Not by our intrinsic worth and intrinsic value and our ability to grow, right? We don't want to be disapproved of. We don't want to lose our image. Therefore, we have a certain sense of vulnerability. We have this fear of failure. We develop this concept of helplessness. In modern literature, they call this learned helplessness. Right? You have a lot of times in education, we talk about this a lot, where kids cannot do things in class, or they say they can't do things in class, to the point where they actually can't do it. And it's what we call learned helplessness. In other words, they become helpless, but it's a learned helplessness because they were so afraid of succeeding, less just in case they fail, right, that they actually learn not to do it, and they really can't. It becomes a reality. Okay. One of the ways we see this just in Jewish history is this. We have the famous story, which we mentioned before, but the famous story of the Meraglim, the spies, when Moses sent spies to the land of Israel to spy out the land. So the Jews are in the desert. Right? Next week is Shavuot. It's the anniversary of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. They come to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. A month later, they're ready to go into Israel. They weren't supposed to spend 40 years in the desert, right? So God what they say, but we need a strategy. I know God promised us the land, but we need to spy out the land to see what's going to happen. So God says, okay, that wasn't part of the plan, but if that's what they want, we'll send spies. They send spies. Now you have to understand, if you look carefully and analyze the verses in the Torah, these spies that they sent, 12 of them, they were great people. They were leaders of the tribes, right? They come back and it's an absolute disaster, right? They come back, they start off by saying it's a pretty good land, but as soon as they start the but, when someone says but, that's the end of the story. However, it's very strong. It's a land that eats its inhabitants. There's giants there. We were like small. We were like grasshoppers in their eyes, and so on and so forth. It's impossible. We can't do it. Ki chazak hu mimenu. It is too strong for us. And the Talmud says that actually what they really started to hint to was really a heretical thought. The word mimenu in Hebrew can mean us, and it can mean him. So they were alluding to the fact ki chazak hu mimenu. It's too strong for us. What they were trying to even say and hint to was that maybe it's too strong for God. Maybe even God can't make this happen, right? And these were great people. And everyone went into a panic, complete fear. Everyone started to cry, the whole nation. There were only 2 people, Joshua and Caleb, who said, no, we can do this. The rest of them said, we can't. They all went into a great panic. They cried all night. And God punished them to remain 40 years in the desert, right? Now, this is a bizarre story. These are people that came out of Egypt. They saw 10 plagues, miraculous plagues of God dismantling the infrastructure of Egypt. They saw the splitting of the Red Sea when they were completely trapped from all sides. God split the sea for them to be able to go by. They witnessed the revelation of Mount Sinai with all the miracles that took place at Mount Sinai and the clarity of the divine revelation that took place at that event. And suddenly they're scared. So the commentaries explain they weren't scared in the sense that they doubted the ability of God. They were scared of themselves. One of the great mystics explains they were scared to go into the land of Israel because they were very familiar and felt safe in the spiritual cocoon of the desert. When they went into the desert, they were spiritually protected. They had the clouds of glory, they had the revelation of Mount Sinai, they had the manna that fell from heaven that God provided for them every single day. They knew all of this and they believed all of this and understood God's ability, but they were scared of their own ability. They were scared that when they go into the land of Israel and they have to plow the land and they have to sow the land and they have to work the land and they have to be involved in the material survival and strategy of earning a living and farming the land and so on and so forth, that they would lose their connection with spirituality. They didn't trust themselves. They thought they would lose their spiritual growth. They would lose their value growth. And they were scared. And they went into total panic. How do we know they were scared of themselves? And how do we know they were insecure? So we know this from a phrase that I've shared with you before. One of the most very interesting things that they said to Moses when they came back. They said that we were in there's giants in that land, and we were in their eyes like as small as grasshoppers. How do they know? How do they know how the people in Israel were looking at them? Right? The Canaanites. So that one of the ways to understand this is a giveaway by another phrase. They said, "Vanehi be'eineinu kachagavim." We were in our own eyes. We felt like grasshoppers compared to them, and therefore we figure that that's how they look at us. Now, were they right to be scared? So I want to share with you an unbelievable insight. The Talmud says, this is a really, really important thing about being scared of failure, or being scared to succeed almost. Talmud says that the night that the spies came back was Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the day that we mourned the destruction of the temple. A day actually that became a day of national tragedy. Lots of bad things happened on Tisha B'Av. But the very first thing that happened was the return of the spies. They came back and they cried that night. And the Talmud says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the great Rabbi Yochanan, the sage of the Talmud, he says that God said to the Jewish people, Atem b'chitem b'chiyah shel chinam, you cry tonight a baseless cry, like a cry of nothing. I will give you what to cry for in the future on this day. Right? And therefore, since that day, every Tisha B'Av became like a disaster day. So the commentaries asked the question, that's kind of cruel. Right? I mean, just imagine this, right? You have your own child, and you're just giving them, ice cream and cookies and taking them to the park, and they're just wonderfully cared for, right? And then your kid gets into a bad mood and they start to just throw a temper tantrum and they cry, right? Okay? So I understand, you tell them to keep quiet. You understand, you tell them to stop being non-appreciative, they should appreciate all the good things so they didn't get the last thing that they wanted. Okay, so what? Right? You send them to their room, whatever you do with them. But no parent says to the child, you're crying for nothing? Look, I'll give you what to cry. I'll bash you up, now you can cry for something. I mean, what kind of, right? What kind of strategy is that? So I understand if God would turn to the Jewish people and say, you cried, that was lack of gratitude. Okay, you're going to stay in the desert for 40 years. That I get it. You didn't want the gift of going to Israel, I won't give it to you. Fine, we get that. You need more time. You need to grow up spiritually. You need to mature. All of that. But you cried for nothing, therefore I'm going to give you something to cry for? What does that mean? But there's a very deep insight. When it comes to fear, when it comes to be afraid of our own success, if you believe it, it becomes true. God said, if you cry tonight a cry for nothing, it will become a cry for something. In other words, you're scared of failing, you will fail. You're scared of succeeding, you won't be able to succeed. Learned helplessness, that's exactly what it is. An adult version of learned helplessness. So it's a vicious cycle, it's a catch-22. The more we become afraid of not being able to do something, the more we become afraid of making decisions, the more we become afraid of building relationships, the more we become afraid to try something new spiritually or emotionally. It starts off with a complete unfounded fear, and it becomes real. Because when it comes to fear, this is the danger of fear. Not only is it paralyzing now, but it becomes a reality. If I believe I can't, then I can't. And that's where it becomes, until I really try to break that cycle. By the way, this idea of fear is something very, very deep-rooted. It's something that's rooted in great, great people. Just to give you a couple of examples. Moses was afraid to become the leader of the Jewish people. He argued with God for 7 days at the burning bush, until God lost it with him, essentially. That's what it says. It says, Vayicha, I'm using a strange expression, but it says, Vayicha, Hashem got angry. In other words, God didn't have a problem with him being hesitant, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But God said, I know you can do this. You need to go back to the Jewish people in Egypt and take them out of Egypt, lead them, become their leader. He says, no, send someone else. I don't speak that well. I'm afraid of public speaking. I'm not sure if I can do that. I'm not sure if they'll listen to me. This is Moses we're talking about, not just anyone, right? And we are taught that for 7 days, he argued with God at the burning bush until God got upset and he punished him. There was a later punishment that Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to be the father of the Kohanim, and the priesthood was taken away from his family and given to Aaron because he argued with God so much, right? We find that with, that famous story you read on Yom Kippur, the story of Jonah. Right? Jonah was a prophet. Now you need to understand, if you read about prophets were great, great people. Right? To become a prophet in ancient times when prophecy existed among the Jewish people, to become a prophet or a prophetess, you had to be a very, very special person, a very pure, lofty, spiritual, great person. Right? Jonah and the whale, exactly. And Jonah is sent by God to a place called Nineveh, and he runs away from God. He doesn't want to go. We read this on Yom Kippur in the afternoon, a famous thing called Maftu Yonah. Right? Why? Why didn't he want to go? He didn't believe in God. He believed in God. He didn't understand the clarity of the instruction. He understood the clarity of the instruction. So what was he scared? He was scared of himself. He was scared he wouldn't succeed. He was scared. What happens if I go to Nineveh and I tell them that God is upset with them and that God is going to punish them and they have 30 days to repent and to mend their ways? Which, by the way, ended up being successful. He actually ended up going to Nineveh and they listened to him and they did tshuva and they repented, which is why we read on Yom Kippur. And he was scared. What happens if they don't listen to me? What happens if I don't have the strength to succeed? He didn't have the confidence. Yonah, the prophet. So if you ever get scared about succeeding, don't feel bad. You're in good company. But you need to. But we need to deal with it, right? So he ran away, and the whole story, he got swallowed up by a fish, and so on, right? Even Yaakov Avinu, when he came back, he was promised by God that everything would be okay. And yet when he comes and confronts his brother Esau, by Yirah Yaakov, the pasuk says, the verse says he was scared. Why was he scared? Maybe I'm not worthy. He wasn't scared because he didn't believe in God. He believed 100% with full faith, but he was scared of himself. He was scared of his own insecurity. He was scared of his own failings, perhaps, that would stand in the way, right? So here, what's the strategy? The strategy is different. Because here the strategy doesn't come from lack. You see, the worry about things that we aren't in control, that comes a little bit from the lack of emunah, the lack of faith, the lack of bitachon. Right? So then we have to work on that. We have to work on faith. We have to work on surrender. We have to work on giving ourselves over into God's hands, into a higher being's hands, into letting go of the future, living in the moment, and so on and so forth. That's the strategy for that. The strategy for the second kind of fear is different. Why? Because it's not about lack of faith in God. It's about lack of faith in ourselves. That's very different. It's about fearing failure. That's our own insecurity. That's the lack of the faith in ourselves, or the lack of the faith of how much God believes in us, not how much we believe in God, as we've talked about before. So here the strategy is like this. You see, when it comes to the first fear, the strategy is to eliminate the fear, right? Through faith and surrender and so on. When it comes to the second kind of fear, we don't eliminate the fear. We confront the fear. And I'll tell you why in a minute why I say we don't eliminate the fear, because the fear has some value to it. But we have to confront it. In other words, we have to jump into the deep end. We have to force ourselves to take risks. Here it's not about perspective so much, it's more about action. It's more about jumping in. It's more about making that decision and trusting ourselves. It's about the perspective that if I fail, it's okay, and let's make that decision. It's about getting up in front or asking the question. You know, in crowds, sometimes people never want to ask a question, right? Because they're afraid maybe they'll make a fool out of themselves until someone else asks the question and makes a fool out of them. So therefore and then they can do it because they feel okay, right? But we have, first of all, we have to confront it. The second thing we have to do with fear, the fear of things that we are in control of, is channel it. And here we get to the channeling aspect of fear. Because there's a good part of fear which we have to understand what it is and take the good out of the fear, not the bad. What do I mean? Let me just start off with a little story, a famous story. In every shtetl in Europe, and now there's also in every community, they have what's called a shochet, someone who shechts chickens and animals in order to be able to eat meat, kosher meat, right? So it was always understood that to choose a shochet, to choose someone who's qualified to be a shochet, would be someone that's, number one, skilled. He knows the skill, he understands the laws. But also someone who's spiritually elevated, because being a shochet is a very big responsibility. Why? There's a lot of trust that's placed in a shochet. Why? Because the shochet shechts himself, no one's watching. And the laws, without going into that, but the laws of shechita, the laws of Jewish law, ritual law, is very, very complex. How the knife has to be completely 100% smooth. And things can go wrong, and little minute things can go wrong to the point where it could invalidate the whole shechita and render the animal unkosher, and no one would ever know. Right? It's not like when a scribe writes tefillin, for example, or a sefer Torah. That's also a lot of laws and intricate laws. But there it's different, because there if the guy messes up, eventually it's going to be checked and he'll be found out, right? It's different. Here no one will ever know. It's just you got to trust the person. He's got to be what they call a yirat shamayim, someone who fears God and is trustworthy. So they tell the story of a shochet that came to a Hasidic Rebbe and he said, I'm resigning. He says, why are you resigning? He says, I don't know. Being a shochet, too much responsibility. And I'm afraid. So the Rebbe turned to him and he said, tell me, who should we appoint as a shochet? Someone who's not afraid? I'm happy you're afraid. Right? What does that mean? In other words, there's a good part of fear when it's in balance. You see, here we go to something I spoke about the first time. That to channel negative emotions into a positive expression needs what we call hitkalalut. It needs the integration between the various character traits. Sometimes it's a matter of dosage, number one, and it's a dosage mixed with other things. And when we get the mix right and the dose right, some of these, in other words, sometimes the expression of a negative emotion has all to do with the fact that it's too high of a dose, and it's in isolation, it's not integrated with good stuff. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. So first of all, let's just explore this a little bit. In Jewish tradition, even with our relationship with God, right, there's a concept we call Yirat Shamayim. Yirat Shamayim. Yirat Shamayim literally means fear of God. Right? In the Torah, there's a commandment to love God and to fear God. Now, what does that mean, to fear God? I don't believe that God wants us to walk around in trepidation and frightened of Him. God is a loving God. God wanted us, again, we're coming up to Shavuot, when He gave us the Torah, and He chose us as a nation. It wasn't just a boss telling people what to do, it was a relationship. It's compared to a marriage in the laws of King Solomon and so on, right? In the writings of King Solomon. It's a loving relationship. So what does it mean, fear of God? So fear of God goes to the concept we talked about before. Fear is not always about being frightened. Fear is about being in awe more. Right? The more correct translation of yirah in that context is awe. Awe means reverence. Respecting something that is higher than me. The concept we talked about before, surrender. In other words, understanding the reality of God and deferring to Him. Giving space for what He tells us to do even when we don't understand. That kind of thing, right? So that's number one. That's the first part of good fear. Sometimes it's about, we find even in the story of Har Sinai, where God gave us the Torah, that it says over there, Vayar ha'am, the nation saw Vayonu and they trembled, which is considered a good thing. What does it mean they trembled? Not because they trembled because they were frightened. They trembled because they understood the seriousness of it. They understood the greatness of it, right? Recognizing greatness sometimes and learning from it or submitting to it and receiving from it is the positive expression, or one of the positive expressions of awe, of fear. It's understanding something that is greater than ourselves, something or another person that has something to offer that we don't have, that we defer to, we submit to. We have enough humility to be able to say, yeah, I get that. I'll connect to that. I'll receive from you, and I don't get it myself, but I understand, I trust you. Right? Which in a very interesting way evolves, and I mention this because it evolves also into the idea of relationships. General, even equal relationships. We know that the two most important ingredients in every relationship is the concept of love and respect. Right? We are taught Kabbalistically that these ideas of love and respect come from Chesed and Gvura, or put differently, Ahava and Yira, love and fear. Now, what is respect? We're not supposed to be fearful of people that we have a relationship with, especially if it's a marriage, an equal relationship. Fear is a bad thing in that sense of being scared. That's an abusive relationship. But what it does mean in terms of a positive expression of fear is respect. Respect means giving space, holding back, right? Just like in regular fear means you hold back from something, right? You don't connect. It goes back to the idea of chesed and gvura. Chesed means you connect. Yira means you hold back, right? So holding back in a positive sense means you give someone their space. You give someone their individuality. You defer to someone. Sometimes you connect, sometimes you give space and you defer. Reverence. The respect for the individual expression or the individual needs of the other person. It's also a sort of positive expression of fear. However, what I really wanted to get to is going back to the story of the shochet, is another very, very important positive concept of fear is the dose of it. In other words, like this. Moses, for example, was scared of becoming the leader. Why did it take God 7 days to get angry with him? Right? He argued with God for 7 days, and then God said, I'm angry. Why 7 days? Why not the first day? God said, be the leader. He says, no, I don't want to. God says, I told you to do it, you don't want to do it, I'm upset. The answer is because the first couple of days were good. That's like the story of the shochet. God didn't want to send a leader that has all the confidence in the world that he can be a leader. Why? Because a good part of fear is a certain consideration of responsibility, understanding the responsibility, and understanding the consequences. Right? In other words, when we confront fear and we go out of our comfort zone and we take risks and we make decisions and we fight with our fear as we should do, but it's not in a way where we do it recklessly, where we do it in a way where we're just impulsive and we say, that's it, I'm not going to worry about anything, I'm just going to jump in. But that's not the way a human being operates. Human being operates with enough humility together with confidence. Right? I'll just give you remember these 10 powers of the soul, right? So if you look at the ones in red, it's the second triangle of emotions. We have something called Netzach on the one hand and Hod on the left side, right? Netzach and Hod need to work together. The translation of the word Netzach is victory, ambition, confidence, overcoming obstacles, taking risks, not letting things stand in the way. But here's the whole thing called hitkalalut, integration. Hod, on the other hand, is submission, humility, holding back. Netzach and Hod need to work together. Then it becomes a good balance of confidence with responsible fear. If we make big decisions in life, we shouldn't make them recklessly. If we take on leadership responsibility, we should do it with consideration. When we make decisions of what to say to people or what to do, we need to consider the consequences. The Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, tells us, who is a wise person? Someone who looks at the consequences, someone who considers the impact of my decisions. I consider the consequences of what I do today and the decisions I make today. That's good. That's responsibility. But not in isolation. In other words, Netzach on its own are ambitious, reckless people that don't have any consideration for other people, put other people down in the process, don't consider their consequences, do things that are irresponsible, that damage themselves and others along the way. Hod in isolation are people that are just scared. Scared of failure, cloaked up, dressed up in the clothing of humility. Not for me, I can't do it, I can't assume that responsibility, I can never public speak, I think I can never be a leader, I can never this, I can never that. Why? Because they're scared of themselves. Either one is negative if it comes in isolation. The mix of it is the positive expression of both. The mix of it is, I have to confront my own fear. I have to not define myself by failure. I have to not define myself by what I achieve and what I don't achieve. I've got to trust my own intrinsic value. I've got to be confident about the infinite potential that God has given me. Right? I've got to understand that God believes in me. As we wake up in the morning and we say, Rabbi Munatecha, the faith in God in us is tremendous. We can always grow. We can go beyond our comfort zone, and the duty of a human being, the journey of a human being always is to go beyond ourselves, to take risks, because sometimes we'll fail and that's fine. And we'll make mistakes, and mistakes are great things because mistakes are the best teachers. But mistakes are the things that we can learn from. All good. But at the same time, there needs to be a balanced, positive element of fear that before I make that decision, let me just think it through to do it in the right way. Let me just think it through if it's the right decision. I'm not going to take 10 weeks to do that, but I'm going to take a little bit of time just to consider what are the consequences of it. Am I doing the right thing? If I'm not sure, let me ask someone else. There needs to be a little bit of fear, right? And that's what that Rebbe was telling that shochet. Who should we give it to? Someone who doesn't care? Someone who's not scared? No, you need to be scared, but not paralyzed by scare. That's the difference. And that's the positive expression, the hitkalalut, the integration between Netzach and Hod. Hitkalalut, by the way, integration is very, very difficult. Because as we've always said, most human beings are one or the other. Most human beings have this position to be locked into one form of emotional expression or the other. So most people are either very ambitious and don't care and always just get up there and are very confident, and some are too humble and too scared and too insecure. Joining the midot together, joining the personality traits together, integrating them together is a very, very difficult thing to do. But that's how we ensure, it's one of the ways we ensure healthy expression of negative emotions. Because every emotion, as we said in the beginning, have a place. And therefore it's finding that positive expression of that emotion by having the strength, but still having the humility to have that small measure of just consideration. Should be a considered decision, not a paralyzed decision, but a considered decision of just thinking about it. What are the consequences? What are the impact? Am I doing the right thing? Now let's go for it. Right? But not to be paralyzed by it and not to get it done. So it's confronting the fear, but retaining the positive aspect of the fear, which of course goes back to the whole Har Sinai model, right? Which is a good expression that I once found. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. In other words, Don't worry about how you're going to be perceived. Don't worry how people are going to... But have the Har Sinai model. In other words, be humble, but be a mountain. Don't be a valley. Don't be a nothing. Have the confidence. A mountain is a symbol of growth. Keep growing, which keep growing means taking risks. It means getting out there. It means taking on leadership. It means taking on things that we haven't been comfortable with yesterday, because it's the only way we grow. If we stay the way we are, we never ever grow, right? It's that growth mindset that we once spoke about at great length. But at the same time, it's got to be a small mountain, because God gave the Torah on a small mountain, because it's got to come together with the humility and the consideration and the positive aspect of fear to make responsible decisions and consider decisions. So that's the positive concept of fear. Just again a reminder that we're going to do this for another 2 weeks. Then we're going to take a break for 1 week on the 20th, and then have a 2-week small series. We've thank you for those who already responded to our raffle. The raffle is an important fundraiser we'll have at dinner. If you haven't yet, please see the